Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, papal legates and penguins, welcome to Clarifying Catholicism. You're watching part 22 of a series on the history of the Ecumenical Councils according to the Catholic Church. Today we are covering the First Vatican Council. Much of this information was gathered from Joseph Kelly's The Ecumenical Councils of the Catholic Church, a History. So if you want an in-depth dive into these topics, make sure to pick up a copy of his book. To see the rest of our episodes, check out our playlist in the description. More than 300 years separated the closure of Trent and the beginning of Vatican I. While that's a lot of history, the most significant events were probably the Church's spread to the Americas. Unfortunately for American Catholics, though, the bishops didn't seem very keen on involving them in this council or their concerns very much. The focus remained very European. As I stated at the end of the last episode, the cultural and intellectual divides between Catholicism and Protestantism only worsened over time. By the closure of Trent, kingdoms tended to be either Catholic or Protestant. But by the beginning of Vatican I, many of Europe's leading powers had no official religion. Many actively excluded religion from politics and public life. Let's take a step back to the rise of secularism. While Protestant countries like England and Germany more or less denied the papacy's influence over them, kings in countries like France, perhaps noticing the decline in papal authority, began asserting their own power over the popes. For example, in the late 1600s, King Louis XVI of France declared that he had the right to approve papal pronouncements for their validity in his country. In 1773, monarchs forced Pope Clement XVI to suppress the Jesuits, whom were characterized by their intense loyalty to the Pope above their commitment to their nations. The trend of Catholic monarchs exerting control over bishops and demanding their allegiance to the state rather than the Church became known as Gallicanism. As Rome struggled to maintain theological and institutional independence from Catholic monarchies, a new challenger to the faith approached in the form of the secular state. I don't have time to address all of the philosophical and scientific shifts that occurred during this time, but to sum it up briefly, secular science seemed to offer people much better lives than Christian metaphysics and theology could. Science, ethics, and politics no longer needed to rely on scripture or dogma, but could instead appeal to reason alone. Societies that embraced these values came to be known as liberal states, and while some of them, such as the United States of America, still embraced religion as a fundamental component of daily life and morality, others did not. Contrary to popular opinion, the French Revolution wasn't very grassroots. It began with some upper-class citizens who sought to take power away from the Church and for themselves. Their solution to seizing power: eliminate the Church from society itself. Obviously, this was a very different brand of liberalism than that of America's. The French Revolution was a bloody affair, and it was ruthless against bishops and popes. When Pope Pius VI opposed some of the French leader Napoleon Bonaparte's policies, such as legalized divorce, Bonaparte arrested him and brought him to France, where he died. By 1804, Bonaparte declared himself emperor without any papal blessing. That said, despite his mistreatment of the last pope, he eventually figured that an alliance with the papacy might still benefit him. Pope Pius VII was somewhat open to liberalism's new ideas. He even preached a homily on the compatibility between Catholicism and democracy. This affair between Catholicism and liberalism was short-lived, though. As Pius pushed back against some of Napoleon's policies, the emperor became frustrated and arrested the Holy Father. He was imprisoned until 1812, when Napoleon was finally defeated. There was a silver lining in all this, though. France's secularization in the French Revolution got rid of many kings and nobles who claimed the allegiance of bishops for their own. Gallicanism stood no match for a government that didn't care about winning over religious support. European-style liberalism's hostility against, if not persecution of, Catholic leaders soured the Church's opinions on the rising philosophy. Concepts like democracy, separation of church and state, and religious tolerance were tainted by the blood of bishops and popes who were killed in the name of liberalism. Finally, in the mid-1800s, the secularist liberals placed the final straw that broke the camel's back. The Papal States were one of the last bastions of papal temporal authority. Fearing a total loss of authority, Pope Gregory XVI wrote encyclicals condemning a few modern liberal principles, blaming all of the Church's ills on the freedom of conscience, speech, and press, as well as the separation of church and state. On a better note, he did condemn slavery and racism. Still, he was quite hostile to liberal ideas. After Gregory's death, the cardinals elected a far more moderate pope, Pius IX. After his election, he proposed a partially representative form of government over the Papal States. He embraced modern technology, relaxed anti-Jewish laws, and granted amnesty to pro-liberal revolutionaries who'd been imprisoned. He was very open to liberal ideas, and he was well-liked until he voiced his opposition to Italian unification into a secular state. When this happened, rebellion broke out. Pius's prime minister was murdered. Rome proclaimed itself a republic in 1849, and Pius's policies suddenly took on a more conservative tone. Forced to flee Rome for a year, Pius could only return with French protection. The French occupied Rome throughout the 1850s. Pius saw a solution to these attacks on papal authority through exercising his teaching authority. So, Pius looked for a theological issue he could flex some of his theological muscle on, and found it in the Immaculate Conception, the idea that the Virgin Mary had been conceived without sin. This ancient teaching had been thrown into question by Protestants. Pius's desire to exercise his teaching authority was compounded by a growing number of reported apparitions people received of the Virgin Mary. By 1854, Pius IX was ready to infallibly declare the Church teaching of the Immaculate Conception as irrevocably true. A bold move considering that most of infallible Church teaching required ecumenical councils. Pius cited his authority as the successor of both the apostles Peter and Paul when declaring that all Catholics must believe this. Pius and his advisors recognized the immense importance of this act. Devotion to the Virgin Mary also spiked after this pronouncement, which was followed by more apparitions. In 1864, Pius published what is now known as the Syllabus of Errors, an encyclical condemning the freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, public schools, the separation of church and state, and democracy. That's lots of stuff. The syllabus was not very well received in democratic states, especially the United States, where even American bishops weren't very fond of it. To dogmatize his positions against liberalism, Pius called a council to meet at the Vatican. Vatican I was predominantly composed of ultra-conservative European bishops. Its opening was attended by 700 bishops, half from Italy and France. Initially, Pius wanted a document very similar to his Syllabus of Errors to be passed by the council. This was wisely declined. Instead, the council's first documents attacked the underlying philosophies that led to the decline of Christian civilization. Many of these ideas are contained in De Filius, which was surprisingly not that harsh in tone. It was approved unanimously in 1870, and it stressed the importance of scripture and tradition, the necessity of faith, and the compatibility between faith and reason. De Filius actually endorsed reason's capacity to know the world and benefit humankind, though it also reinforced reason's incompleteness without faith. After De Filius, the bishops sought to address papal infallibility, the Pope's ability to teach teachings without error. Perhaps surprisingly, given the preceding centuries of conciliarism, the Council Fathers overwhelmingly desired to approve of infallibility. Pastor Aeternus describes the preeminence of the Roman bishop, that is the Pope, above the entire Church. It affirmed the Pope's complete authority over all of his bishops, which set the final nail in the coffin against Gallicanism. Regarding doctrinal authority, some bishops were ready to say that all the Pope's teachings were infallible. This, luckily, was a minority opinion. Here's what they came up with instead. We teach and define, as a divinely revealed dogma, that when the Roman Pontiff speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in the discharge of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, and by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines that a doctrine concerning faith or morals must be held by the whole Church. He possesses, through the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, that infallibility with which the Redeemer willed in his Church to be endowed in defining a doctrine concerning faith or morals, and that such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are irreformable of themselves, not from the consent of the Church. All right, that's a bit of a long sentence. Let's break this down. Here are the conditions or contexts in which popes can speak infallibly. Number 1, it must concern a divinely revealed dogma. Number 2, it must concern faith or morals. Number 3, the pronouncement must be made when he is speaking as the teacher of all Christians. The day after this was approved, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, thus abruptly closing the council. Recall how at the beginning of the series, I emphasized how sometimes conciliar solutions raised more questions than answers. For example, well, what constitutes a matter of faith or morals? What happens if the Pope says something heretical when speaking ex cathedra? Even though Vatican I is over 150 years old, many of these questions are still debated today, and I wouldn't be surprised if they came up at a future council. See you next time.